Clown Eater. Written by Stories from the Attic. Narrated by Robin McConnell. Some people are scared of clowns. It's a real phobia. I read once that it's something about their smiles. The painted grins are just a little too wide, and whatever it is in our heads that recognizes faces gets twitchy. It isn't wired to see a smile or a mouth that wide without instantly thinking of teeth, seeing the threat of a mouth that wide as something with a potential to bite or even to consume. Of course that's ridiculous. Most of the time. I'm not scared of clowns. I've worked with enough of them, metaphorically at least, to have developed an immunity. The only literal clown I ever worked with wasn't frightening either. But the thing that scared him, the thing that clowns are scared of, well, that I am scared of too. It's the reason I no longer do what I did, and why my hair stands on end at the tinkling sound of bells. Of course, there had always been strange ones. In my line of work you get to meet some truly eccentric people who keep the strangest hours, display the strangest habits, and generally spend much of their time out of step with the rest of the world. I guess in some cases that's why they need protection in the first place. I've honestly lost count of the times that I've obediently looked the other way, stoically silent, whilst God knows what went on just meters away. I could fill entire shelves of books with stories like that, but then that just isn't done. Keeping your mouth shut, being as much a pillar for the client as the stone ones that hold up the rooms in which they do what they do, is all part of working in security. Bodyguards don't just protect people physically, they protect their secrets as well. Almost daily I'd be approached by guys from the newspapers who wanted to hear the salacious details about this or that celebrity. Sometimes they'd have something specific in mind, the scent of a story, or some fragmentary detail from which they hoped to build a story. Other times they had nothing and would just be fishing for gossip, trying to work out what fictions they could weave from the crumbs you might give them. In all cases, short shrift was the best approach. I was in my first year on the job when I learned that. A colleague of mine, a veteran bodyguard by the name of Cliff Hanlon, gave me some solid advice. Good reporters, he said, would follow the breadcrumbs and eventually find the witch's house. Bad reporters would take the few breadcrumbs you give them and make a trail of their own, with an entire gingerbread house of their invention at the end of it. If they come to you and ask you anything, say nothing. When they come sniffing for breadcrumbs, there's only one approach that works. Leave them to starve. I suppose it's a more roundabout way of saying silence is golden. But the image stuck with me, and in my 30 years on the job, it's the best piece of advice I ever received. Whenever I was asked about a client, I gave the same answer: a fixed glare and stony silence. This is why, for some, it may seem strange that I have chosen to talk about these things now. That without being asked, coerced, or blackmailed, I've decided to give away, unsolicited, and with no prospect of payment from one of those lurid red-top tabloids that hounded me all those years, everything. For those who know me well, and those are few and far between, it won't seem so strange. I'm telling what I know for two reasons. Firstly, because it's the right thing to do, and secondly, because in 30 years in security, 30 years in which I've had countless hair-raising encounters, it was the only time that I was ever really scared. When I first heard about the job, I expected it to start like every other, with the 4 keys. The 4 pieces of information that any half-decent bodyguard needs at the outset of a new assignment. When, where, who, and who from. When dignitaries, government officials, or certain celebrities were involved, those questions could be a big deal, especially when and where. Planning sometimes took place weeks or even months before, with every last detail and spare second of the day mapped out and scheduled in advance, with careful attention to the client's budget, notoriety, and of course the size of threat against them. The movements of the client around which this story centres were planned weeks ahead of time, with everything from the guy's lunch menus to the duration of his toilet breaks, for which I was delighted to discover I was required to be present, worked out with a clockmaker's precision well in advance. I knew what I would be doing almost every moment of every day for the first 2 months, with a promise that the job might last far longer than that if the threat level was deemed to still be high. This, however, was not enough. Whilst it was true that my movements had been laid out meticulously, I was unhappy with the things I had not been told. The 2 pieces of information that I considered to be of the greatest importance. Who exactly I was protecting, and more importantly still, who was I supposed to be protecting them from? I got the first piece of information the night before the job commenced. I was to be guarding Almo the Clown. At first I thought that the supervisor was joking, but the hollow look in the man's eyes convinced me immediately that it was true. My new job was protecting a clown. Not that Almo ever made an appearance whilst I was around. During our time together he was decidedly off-duty, and as far as I'm aware had already resigned himself to never playing the role of Almo again. When out of character and portraying only himself, it was sometimes hard to imagine that this guy could ever have been a clown. He just didn't seem the type to don the makeup and loud clothes or to fool around to amuse children. Without the makeup, Almat Beyran, which was the client's real name for those noting down these breadcrumbs, was a quiet, intelligent and thoughtful man. Not what I'd expected from a clown. Compared with some people I've been charged with looking after over the years, he was a delight, and at the end of the first day of our acquaintance I found myself sitting outside his hotel room door in a cheap armchair brought up for the purpose, reasoning that this could be quite an easy gig. That first night, it was. Early the next morning, Almat took breakfast with one of my relief workers and an additional hotel security guard whilst I caught up some sleep. That afternoon, I was informed that changes had been made to the schedule and that in 2 days I would be making somewhat of a strange visit with Almat. I must admit that even at the time, not knowing what I know now, I still thought it was odd. I'm sure that a lot of the people hearing these words will be unaware that a clown museum is even a thing that exists in real life. But trust me, it does. I had certainly never heard of it, and once again, when the details of the visit were given to me, I initially thought it was a joke. As it turned out, and as a quick search on Google confirmed, the Clown Museum in Somerset is very real. Not only that, but it is split over 2 separate sites. Primarily intended to house a collection of memorabilia and paraphernalia relating to the art of clowning, the museum is home to many items that date back hundreds of years, and indeed has a few exceedingly rare and valuable pieces. More importantly, however, it has eggs. As Almat reliably informed me later that day, the Clown Museum was also home to the International Clown Registry, where each performer not only makes a record of his performance name and intention to be a clown, but crucially shares the design of his makeup. It had long been a tradition that no 2 clowns were allowed to wear the same face paint design, and indeed some performers were highly protective of the details of their particular look, believing that the idiosyncrasies of the design distinguished them from other acts. To collect these designs and to avoid duplication by displaying them for all to see, each clown that registers is required to paint their face with their distinctive makeup design onto a hard-boiled egg. That egg is then placed alongside the others in a huge display case that dates back over 100 years and showcases the designs of many famous acts. In the past, the designs were painted onto genuine hard-boiled chicken eggs. Nowadays they are printed or painted onto ceramic imitations. The reason for the switch was partially due to Almat. He explained the details of the museum in the early evening of that second day. He had been sitting by the window in his hotel room whilst I made a coffee and prepared for another night's shift out in the corridor, perched in the chair by the door, when he had suddenly decided entirely unprompted to tell me why I was there. This began with an explanation of the Clown Museum and a deadly insistence that clowning was a noble pursuit, and that those within the fraternity, which he described with the same reverence that magicians talk about the magic circle, took very seriously. I had nodded, straight-lipped at this, for, as absurd as it sounded, I could tell that Almat meant it. He told me about his registration and how his makeup design was a combination of elements worn by his father and uncle, both of whom were no longer living, but whose boiled egg records were themselves on display at the museum. Then, with little warning, he began to cry. At first I said nothing, thinking that the impromptu shredding of tears was somehow linked to this mention of his dead relatives, but after watching him for a few moments, seeing his shoulder rise and fall as he sobbed, I noticed that he was trembling. Struggling to regain his composure, he beckoned me to take a seat by the window opposite him, which I silently did. The sun was sinking by this point, and in its final shrinking rays, as they glanced, struggled through the glass, Almat looked far older than he had the previous day. The lines of his face seemed to have been weathered by his sobs, as if the tears themselves had washed away a surface layer of years. He at once looked old and, more strikingly, terrified. From the satchel by his feet, he produced a small, tattered-looking scrapbook, which he opened before me on the table as he coughed, clearing his throat and attempting to compose himself. "When I was young," he began, "my uncle would tell me about Sakudja. Growing up, I thought it was something that he had invented. It was only years later, when I registered as a clown and began corresponding with others around the world, that I realized how deep the idea went. It wasn't just my uncle or my father, or me. Everyone knows Sakudja, or at least every clown does. If you say the word in front of a clown, they go suddenly quiet. Saying it at a circus is reason enough not to perform that night, like saying Macbeth in a theatre. Sakudja is our bogeyman, made just for clowns, a myth or a spooky story that only we know in our weird little group. There are different versions, yeah, and sometimes the details change, but some things are always the same, and every clown that has ever smeared on grease paint has at least once looked over his shoulder in case Sakudja is waiting." I said nothing and stared hard at Almat. If he was unstable, then this gig was going to be a lot harder than I thought. Undeterred by my non-committal silence, he leaned forward and opened the book. Inside, on the first page, there was a photograph of what looked to me like a fresco painted on some old wall, which Almat clarified was exactly what it was. The image itself was of a hideous thing. From the neck down, it had the body of a large, muscular but hunchbacked man, dressed like a harlequin or a jester, in a blue and yellow suit that stretched from the toes to the throat. Here, however, split from the body by something like the ruff you saw on kings and queens from the Renaissance, was a sprouting, tangled clutch of 8 hideous heads. The necks upon which these faces sat bled together a browned tangle of swollen muscles, veins and sinews, whilst each wretched head wore a jester's 3-point hat adorned with tiny bells. Each face, meanwhile, coloured the off-blue brown of rotted fruit, grinned hungrily, displaying to the onlooker row upon row of shark-like teeth. "This," Almat said, pointing at the photograph, "is Sakudja. In my uncle's story, he was the devil's fool, a jester to the king's court in hell. In other stories, he's a thing made up of several jinns who were trapped together in a jar and eventually melded together. In northern France, it's the spirits of clowns that were cruel to children or who did wicked things to disgrace the trade." Almat flipped the page and ran his finger slowly over the image. For a second, I thought it was the same image, but a closer look revealed it to be altered and changed. It was the same painting, but now the jutting fangs were covered by the jolly paint of a clown. Each of the thing's heads was painted with a different design. One was black and white, with upturned triangles like angular tears beneath the eyes. Another, a mess of blues and reds, with a cross painted over the eyes and a crimson slash for a mouth. Yet another had swathes of yellow in the ridges where the eyebrows meet the nose. Again, Almat prodded at the image. The first photo is of a painting on a wall from the old theatre in St. Vitus's Square. He's the patron saint of entertainers. The photo was taken in 1911, but the painting is centuries old. The second image is the same painting in 1921. They changed it? I asked, admittedly somewhat intrigued by Almat's kooky story. Almat didn't answer or even nod, but instead simply flipped the page. The next page featured the images of 8 men, all in full clown makeup. It took me less than a second to recognize some of the designs. The yellow crescent on the eyebrows, the black upturned triangles, the designs were the same. It feeds on them and wears their makeup. Maybe it was meant as a way to discourage people from stealing each other's designs, but he gripped the back of his neck with the palm of his hand. In 1920, every one of these men disappeared. They were never seen again. Other photographs show the painting changing gradually, each face, one by one, suddenly becoming painted. It's a horror story that clowns share. There was even going to be a display about it at the Clown Museum, but... He trailed off, pouring now at his eyes in an attempt to wipe away the tears. I lifted the book from him and began flipping through the pages. The sequence was always the same. A painting of this thing, firstly with the 8 hideous grins and dagger-like teeth, then a second photograph with the faces painted over with the gaudy designs of a clown's makeup. On the following page, there was always a collection of photographs, men in various poses, wearing their clown costumes. As I flipped the pages, the volume of material in each sequence increased. News reports were now included, clippings about men having gone missing, often with no mention of them having been a clown. As the amount of information increased, I realized that I was flipping through the decades. The first entry had been 1920, the next 1940, and so on every 20 years up to the present. In recent decades, with the advent of the internet and the increased speed with which ideas and information could be transferred, the number of entries increased greatly. Now there was even a smattering of rumours and reports about the legend itself. Former clowns who had written reports about it, folklorists researching the shared superstitions of closed groups had written papers about it, and at every 20-year milestone, photographs of men who had disappeared. I flipped back to the first photograph, to the thing sans makeup, the brown, leathery skin of its face stretched across ill-sized bones and the teeth like a badly taxidermized reptile. I closed the book and handed it back to Almat. Thing is, over the past year, 7 men who are registered clowns have gone missing, all of them living in Britain. After the 3rd man went missing, we contacted the police with this story, trying to get them to see the link, the fact that these men shared a profession, and that it was this detail that should be pursued, but they wouldn't listen. The men were missing, not dead. They were registered as missing persons, but they were not investigating any link between the disappearances in different parts of the British Isles, especially not one that suggested they might have been... Almat's head sank again. Eaten? I finished for him, as he nodded deeply and held out for me a photograph on his phone. It showed the egg register of clown makeup from the museum. There were 7 smashed eggs. The next egg in sequence, the last in the display, was untouched. It did not take a genius to work out who that design belonged to. That night, I again took up my post in the corridor as Almat slept. I got myself settled with a coffee I had ordered earlier and, sighing deeply, prepared for what was undoubtedly going to be a long night. One of the downsides to this line of work, some might say the biggest, is the boredom. There isn't much to stimulate the mind sitting in the empty corridor of a hotel. Pale beige walls, vapid and inoffensive paintings of orchids, a thick red carpet that stretched away like a long streak of blood off to the end and around the blind corner of the next corridor, and of course, the quiet. Save for the initial shuffling of Almat in his room as he prepared for bed, the corridor was silent, and since he finally succumbed to sleep, there had not been a sound on this floor. The hush should not have been creepy. It wasn't like I was in the dark, in fact, far from it. The entire length of the hallway was lit with horrible overhead lights. Nor was it as if I were sitting in some creepy run-down motel or the dank of some haunted house. Yet, there was something not quite right. I have always felt there was something desolate about the artificiality of hotels, particularly the hallways. The standardized and sanitized colors and ornaments, the enforced uniformity, always seemed to me to be somehow unnatural, inhuman. The removal of any idiosyncrasy was worse in the big chains, and in the later hours when nothing stirred, the halls seemed remarkably, almost nakedly empty. But this one wasn't. It was around 4 a.m. I had admittedly begun to nod a little, an admission I would not be making had I not retired a few years ago. My head had just begun to sink, my eyes to close heavily, when I was disturbed by a sound. A soft, cushioned thud, as of something heavy landing on a quilted surface, and with it, the distant jingle of tiny bells. It was the same soft jingle that you can't escape at Christmas. It seems to appear on every Christmas song, meant, I think, to imitate sleigh bells. It was as if, somewhere around the corner at the end of the corridor, someone was lightly tapping a tambourine at regular intervals, whilst thumping the ground with a weight or club. There would be a pause, a long stretch of silence, then the soft, dissonant jangle as of a group of bells in perfect time with the thud. I tried to think what manner of thing would make that sound, searched my mind for any suggestion other than the one that pressed itself most urgently forward, but my thought was interrupted by another, clearer, closer thud. One thing I did know, simply from the force of the impact, was that whatever was making that sound, it was big. I stared blankly down the corridor, following that long red streak of carpet, past pine-coloured doors, markers of space between me and the sound, and thought about beginning to move slowly along them. I sat upright in the chair, now suddenly awake, and watched the bend where this corridor met the next, a blind corner around which something was making that noise, and, judging by the volume, slowly but surely getting closer. I rose, quietly and cautiously from my chair, never taking my eyes off the end of the hall, and realized for the first time in my longer career that I was scared. I admonished myself, even going so far as to physically shake my head. They're stories, I told myself. Stupid little myths were created by a group to stop people from stealing other people's designs. Yet, with each soft thud, each tiny jingle of the bells like those, I knew, that hung at the tip of a jester's hat, I felt the hair rise on my arms and my neck. As the image of some hulking thing hunched forward as the weight of its many heads pulled it, lurching onward, clown makeup smeared across some faces whilst the others, unadorned, sported that leathery brown skin and huge pointed teeth. Moving as silently as possible and with a final glance back at the door I was guarding, I began very slowly to pace toward the end of the corridor, toward the hard left bend and the next stretch in which, I believed, whatever was making the sound was lurking. As I approached the blind bend, I paused, and for the first time in over a decade, unclipped the holster of my gun. As I did, however, an image stopped me. Across to my right was a painting, a bog-standard, nondescript daubing of lilacs or some other inoffensive plant. The framed painting was hanging at the furthest end of my corridor, facing straight down the next, the one that waited for me, around the sharp corner. At first glance I wished that this painting was itself a mirror, and realized that, of course, the glass of the frame would provide something of a glimpse, a blurred, indistinct, but at least partial view of the entire corridor. Even as these thoughts crossed my mind, however, I caught sight of what was reflected in the glass. I saw the long red expanse of carpet, the beige uniform rows of pine doors, and the thing staring directly back with 8 pairs of eyes. The vision lasted less than a moment, after which I had turned away, sprinted towards Almat's room, and in a matter of seconds had flung the door open, bundled him, still in his underwear, out of bed and down the fire escape as I called for a support car to meet us in the street below. Once in the car, panting, and I am not ashamed to admit, shaking in every part of my body, I handed the spare clothes we always stored for such situations to Almat and told the driver to head onto the motorway toward the Clown Museum. No way was I waiting 2 weeks. This needed fixing, and fixing now. Driving through what remained of the night, we arrived at the museum extremely early the next morning, an aggressive and demanding phone call from yours truly having summoned the curator out of bed to open up for us. We made only one stop on the way there, at a 24-hour supermarket where I had the driver buy 2 dishcloths and a bottle of white spirit. He complained of the looks the cashier would give him for buying near pure alcohol at 6 a.m, but he did as he was asked anyway. Having been let into the museum itself, Almat explained his situation and, with the help of the scrapbook, succeeded in at least partially scaring the life out of the curator. He also explained his wish to cancel his registration as a clown. Whilst the curator drew up some document for Almat to sign to this effect, no such document of the kind had existed up until that point, I was led with Almat to the egg register. Seeing the lines of painted faces, their 2 wide smiles and dead, expressionless eyes all staring blankly forward at the same time, again brought a chill to my bones, as for a moment the fleeting image of what I thought I had seen in the corridor resurfaced and, in particular, the detail of 7 faces already painted. Using the white spirit and the rag, Almat, under my instruction and somewhat reluctantly, wiped the paint from his egg, the design he had registered as his own, to be used only by Almo the Clown, dissolved into a milky residue of white and blue. Looking back at me, he asked if I thought this would work. I shrugged. Thieves can't steal when there is nothing left to take, concluding that the best we could do was hope. As it turned out, this approach did seem effective. Almat is still alive and well, though he never again donned the makeup nor participated in any activity that could be construed as clowning. Almo the Clown was no longer registered and could be considered either dead or retired. I prefer to think of him as the latter. As for me, I also retired not a fortnight after that night. I have often thought back to what I thought I saw that night. Tried to convince myself that perhaps it was just a suggestion, that fatigue, suggestibility, and perhaps a desire to be out of the job once and for all, combined to conjure from my imagination something that should and indeed could never exist in reality. After all, it was only a fleeting glance. For a while, I almost convinced myself. Then the clowns started to turn up. Over 9 months last year, all 7 of the men who had been reported missing were found, or rather, their bodies were, in whatever form they still existed. Details released to the press were sketchy, though from what I was told by a colleague with an inside connection, in every case the skin of the face had been removed and some part of the body, a limb, a foot or a hand, sometimes the entire lower portion, legs and all, was missing. There was never any mention of them all having been clowns. 5 of the murders were claimed by, and indeed quietly attributed to, an inmate currently being detained at Broadmoor High Security Psychiatric Hospital, and for a while, tragic as it is, this news gave me some comfort. At least, I thought, the killings could be attributed to a human agency rather than any supernatural phenomenon, and to someone who is in custody and therefore no longer a threat. However, a few incidents in the past couple of weeks changed that view. The first was an encounter with a friend who works for the Metropolitan Police Department, who, after a few drinks, explained to me the practice of black drawing. This process, he explained, involved pinning murders or other crimes that the department would like to go away on people who were incapacitated mentally and who would willingly take the blame. Though not a common occurrence and certainly not something that would ever become official policy, cases that would expose incompetence or malpractice and disgrace the service nevertheless had a habit of being swallowed by inmates at Broadmoor and other psychiatric facilities housing dangerous criminals. Disturbed minds, all too happy, or at least quietly willing, to accept the blame and tie up those annoying loose ends. This idea gnawed at me. Was it possible? Certainly, it would be greatly embarrassing for the department if it were ever made public that the police missed the connection between these men, that they overlooked something as glaringly obvious as the fact that they were all registered clowns and were killed in the order that they registered. That, had the connection been made after the second death, the other 5 could have been protected. Such a revelation would show the department in an unbelievably bad light indeed. Pity that. For though the idea seems far-fetched, it did to me up until a few days ago. I am now convinced that this is the case, and I don't mind telling you why. A few days ago, I was searching through the invoices of the security company I worked for and, out of pure curiosity, looked back to see exactly who it was that had engaged our services to look after Almat. I always knew it wasn't the man himself, but had never been clear on exactly who had enough of an interest in keeping Almat alive to pay for a full-time bodyguard. I had to read the listed name 3 times before I believed what I was seeing. It seems the Metropolitan Police Department were very keen to ensure that 7 did not become 8. That they were aware of the link between these men, I have no doubt. Whether they knew what was causing the disappearances, I do not know, though it does seem odd that the police would hire an outside agency to handle protection, almost as if they were unwilling to put any of their own in harm's way, or in the path of something that batons and bullets might not stop. As for me, I have reached the conclusion that whatever it was I saw that night was real. The idea that they knew all along makes me angry, but does nothing to comfort me or help me reconcile what I saw with my beliefs about the nature of reality and what should and should not be real. All I can say is that I now tend to go abroad around Christmas to a country that doesn't celebrate it and where I don't have to hear the jangling of tiny bells. I have explained the events as I understand them here, in the hope that one of the good journalists might follow the breadcrumbs and find a gingerbread house. Though I must admit that even that idea scares me, for I fear that if they do, they will find something far worse than a fairy tale that is prowling the darkness inside. This has been Clown Eater, a short, scary story, written by Stories from the Attic, narrated by Robin McConnell. Copyright 2020 by Michael Vandervoort. Production copyright by Michael Vandervoort.